Thank you very much. I would like to thank the task force for their inspiring work and for allowing me to testify. I prepared a little slide presentation titled "The Wealth Gap and Lost Wages Due to Slavery." Is that slideshow available? Okay. Can you see it on the screen? Yes. All
Yes,
right.
yes.
Thank you. Um, if you could put on the next slide, please. Please forward the slide. Okay. This is what I will be speaking about, and I will address my personal motivation for the research at the end. Next slide, please. I will first introduce myself. Next slide. My name is Thomas Kramer. I'm an associate professor at the University of Connecticut's Department of Public Policy. I obtained a political science doctorate in 2001 from the University of Tübingen in my native Germany, and a PhD from Stony Brook University, New York in 2005. My research focuses on implicit and explicit racial attitudes in the United States and how they influence people's opinions on race-related policies, including slavery reparations. Next slide, please. I was asked to testify about the black-white wealth gap and its likely origin in the historical injustices of slavery and post-slavery de jure anti-black racial discrimination. Next slide. William Darity and Kirsten Mullen in their book From Here to Equality write, next slide, we view the racial wealth gap as the most robust indicator of the cumulative economic effects of white supremacy in the United States. So that includes slavery and post-slavery discrimination. Next slide, please. I use average household net worth figures provided by Buta et al. For the year 2019 to compute the per capita black-white wealth gap. I will explain in a moment why I use average rather than median net worth figures. The gap in average household wealth in 2019 amounted to $840,900. Next slide, please. Then I divided each group's average household wealth figure by the average household size in 2019 based on US Census figures. Next slide, please. And arrived at an average per capita wealth gap of $358,293. Next slide. In other words, if the goal of reparations to African American descendants of the enslaved in the US is the elimination of the wealth gap, net reparations would have to amount to at least $358,293 per eligible recipient. I cannot know ahead of time how many people will be eligible, and eligibility criteria may be in flux for a while. So I'm using readily available numbers from the US Census to estimate the number of African American descendants of the enslaved in the US. I take the number of non-Hispanic blacks or African Americans in the US Bureau of the Census's count, which in 2019 amounted to approximately 41 million individuals. This will inevitably include some black people without enslaved ancestors in the US, but it may miss some otherwise eligible individuals as well. So this is a very rough estimate. With this estimate, an amount of roughly $14.7 trillion would be sufficient to close the average per capita black-white wealth gap in one fell swoop. Next slide, please. While this is technically possible, it would be very difficult for an individual state like California to provide that kind of reparations. For example, if California were to pay the roughly estimated 2 million black non-Hispanic descendants of the enslaved in the US, again a rough estimate of eligible recipients that lived in the state in 2019, that amount in reparations, it would spend $778.6 billion in 2019 dollars. However, the state's budget in 2019 was only, and I use only in quotation marks, $215 billion. Nowhere near enough to cover the expenses. Instead, California could exert pressure on the federal government to provide federal-level reparations. After all, it was the federal government that allowed slavery to exist in the United States. Thus, it would be proper for the federal government to provide reparations. Next slide. So why not take the lower median per capita wealth gap, which could be closed with a reparations budget of only, and again, only in quotation marks, $2.87 trillion in 2019 dollars. The median is a statistical procedure to produce the typical amount of wealth in a population unaffected by some very rich outliers. Given that slave owners tended to be rich outliers among whites, and by extension their heirs today, we would miss all of these estates if we went by the statistical procedure of the median. The mean better represents the entire contribution, rich as well as poor, in each group. Next slide. Another reason that I would opt for the larger average wealth gap as a basis for reparations rather than the smaller median wealth gap is that losses in wages to African American enslaved alone can account for the current average per capita wealth gap based on a rough back of the envelope calculation. The calculation only considers withheld wages during the period of slavery in the United States, not colonial slavery, and it does not consider post-slavery anti-Black racial discrimination, not because this is not important, but because further research would be required. Next slide. What is required for the back of the envelope calculation is an estimate of the enslaved population in each year from 1776 to 1860. Numbers for the Civil War years are too unreliable to estimate. To keep my calculation conservative, I'm therefore ignoring them. Next slide, please. The US Bureau of the Census provides counts of the enslaved population in each decade from 1790 to 1860. To estimate the enslaved population between decennial censuses, I use linear interpolation, and for the years before 1790, linear extrapolation. More sophisticated methods can be used, but I'm going with the simplest one, and the results are not that different. Next slide, please. Then I turn to Officer and Williamson's historical records of unskilled hourly wages in nominal dollars in the years 1790 to 1860. Which again are very conservative, as many of the enslaved were in fact skilled. In fact, they were often selected for their skills. I use an estimation procedure for the years before 1790. I should mention that the hourly wages are incredibly small. In 1790, the average hourly wage for an unskilled laborer amounted to 2 cents, and by 1860, it had risen to 8 cents per hour. This is another feature that makes my back of the envelope calculation extremely conservative. Now I turn to the question how many hours the enslaved lost through enslavement. Enslavement for life, and it was heritable from generation to generation. This meant that the enslaved had no control over how to spend their time in the free labor market sense. They lost control over all 24 hours of the day. Slave owners benefited from this enslaved only during the time the enslaved were performing field work for cash crop production, because that yielded products that could be exchanged for money on a market. However, the enslaved produced many services that were not exchanged for money on a market, from draining the fields, building and maintaining plantations, to producing clothing, cooking food, raising their own and the slave owners' children, and so on. That work often lasted into the night. Sleep was granted by the slave owner based on his or her own self-interest considerations, not the interests of the enslaved. The question, therefore, is, what would a slave owner have had to pay free laborers on the labor market to be on call for 24 hours a day, 365 days a year? Economists like to deduct from this amount time for sleep as well as the cost for food and shelter. But based on basic assumptions of market economics, this is, in my view, wrong-headed. It would only make sense if the enslaved had been part of the negotiations, but they were not. The price of an enslaved person was negotiated between two slave owners, never including the voice of the enslaved. Food and shelter remained the property of the slave owner, even when it was consumed by the enslaved. Next slide, please. Did I miss a slide? If you could go further. I think I missed one instruction. If you could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is an excerpt from my Excel spreadsheet, which is cut off in 1794, but continues to 1860 and compounds the amount up to the present time. So the next step in my computation is to take the number of enslaved in the United States in each year times 24 hours a day times 365 days a year times the puny historical hourly wage and add a moderate interest rate to the total to reflect non-payment. In my example, I'm using only 3% interest, which is unlikely to be enough to make up for inflation. It's a very conservative amount. More realistic would be 6%, the amount of interest specified, for example, in the sales contract of Georgetown University when it sold 272 enslaved in 1838 to save the institution from financial ruin. Next slide, please. But I'm going with a much more conservative interest rate of 3%. With that, I arrive at a 2019 estimate of $19.14 trillion. Next slide, please. I should mention that merely doubling the interest rate to the more realistic 6% would exponentially blow up the total estimates to $6.6 quadrillion 2019 dollars. Next slide, please. Thus, the interest rate will be the most important figure to negotiate between the descendant community and the federal government should such negotiations begin in earnest. Next slide. So let me stick with a 3% compound interest estimate of $19.14 trillion. Next slide. Now, the average amount of reparations owed per US resident can be estimated by using the US Bureau of the Census's count of the 2019 US population, which included approximately 328 million individuals. This includes everyone who at least indirectly benefits from the startup capital that slavery provided to the US economy today. It includes first-generation immigrants like myself, as well as African American descendants of the enslaved, as well as everybody else. Each US resident would owe on average $58,302. African American descendants of the enslaved in the US would receive reparations in a larger amount, and the net amount, if you subtract that $58,000, would be $406,785 per eligible recipient in 2019 dollars. This means that wage-based reparations at only 3% interest would comfortably close the 2019 average per capita black-white wealth gap of $358,293. Next slide. Of course, this only addresses losses due to withheld wages during US slavery and thus lost inheritances. What is missing is colonial slavery as well as post-slavery de jure anti-Black racial discrimination. And missing, according to Professor Swinton's proposed comprehensive formulas, are lost freedom during colonial and US slavery, as well as lost opportunities to acquire capital, as well as pain and suffering during all these time periods. Next slide. Thus, in conclusion, the average per capita, next slide, sorry. The average per capita black-white wealth gap should be considered a minimum amount of reparations to restore a status of fairness. Next slide. Slavery produced the startup capital for the rise of the US economy at the exclusive expense of the African Americans who were enslaved. Their descendants deserve recognition of this fact through a comprehensive federal reparations program. Next slide. Whatever California can do to support the call for federal reparations to the African American descendants of the enslaved in the US will be an exercise in the restoration of justice. Next slide, please. I will close my statement with a personal motivation for my research. Next slide. My interest in the question of race, racism, and reconciliation is based on my experience of growing up in Germany. Next slide. And learning about the Holocaust in every high school subject, I felt ashamed of our German history and always dreamed of being able to express to a Holocaust survivor how I felt. Of course, I never thought I would have the chance. Next slide. One day, though, I met Mieczysław Langer, a survivor of 5 concentration camps and a death march in his youth. He and his wife had just retired from Israel to my hometown of Tübingen, Germany, of all places. Next slide. I was amazed at how this man, who had suffered so much at German hands, was able to trust in younger Germans like myself and in Germany as a country after all that he had suffered in his youth. Next slide. I learned later that he had received a reparations pension of about $2,000 a month from the 1970s all the way to 2015 when he unfortunately passed away. Over a period of roughly 45 years, this would amount to a little over $1 million, an amount, of course, that is merely symbolic as it could not possibly compensate for all that Mieczysław had suffered. He lost his entire larger family and barely survived himself. Next slide, please. The purpose of the reparations pension was to serve as a material token of sincerity, giving way to German promises to never let it happen again. And I think this is all that reparations can be. A symbolic gesture giving weight and credibility to words of apology for historical injustices. Next slide. And with that, I say thank you very much.